Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. This podcast explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, always with the underlying question of how can we work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people, not just for ourselves, but for all those with whom we are nested in relationship, human and non-human, presently, in the past, and forward onto the future. So with that said, one of the ways that we can become better people is always, of course, utilizing psychedelics for psychotherapeutic purposes, to heal wounds that are within us that are negatively contributing to how we show up to those relationships, how we show up to our entire lives, and sort of the inner dynamic with which we are experiencing what it is to be a person alive in this world. And of course, psychedelics can positively assist in therapy, as well as therapy can positively assist in psychedelics, and both of which can assist in a kind of remapping of how we understand our minds, how we experience and navigate reality, and how we come to meet not only ourselves, but the world. And so today's episode is exploring therapy and psychedelics, but not just any kind of therapy, a specific form of therapy. Internal Family Systems, which you've probably heard before. We've talked about it here on the show in the past with Frank Anderson in an episode number that I don't have immediately reference, so I'll make it really big on the screen here on YouTube, but also link it into the show notes here. So today's episode is going to be exploring internal family systems therapy and how it can be integrated into psychedelic therapy. And our guest is Bob Falconer. Bob Falconer has been a therapist for some 40 years and has come to focus exclusively on IFS as he believes it is the most potent and respectful way of working he has found. Bob has been at many workshops and events with Richard Schwartz, the originator of IFS, both as an assistant and participant. In addition to studying with many other senior IFS trainers, he also co-authored a book with Richard Schwartz titled Many Minds, One Self. Furthermore, Bob has been involved with psychedelics since 1967 and has been bringing his long history of IFS and psychedelics together into the body of work which informs the conversation you will hear today. And in this conversation, together, Bob and I lay the groundwork for what internal family systems therapy is, its foundational propositions about the nature of the mind, and both how IFS works and how therapists work with IFS to bring about healing. From that foundation, we go into the unique benefit IFS has to offer psychedelic therapy and how to use IFS in both preparation and integration of psychedelic experiences. We also talk about generative change versus counteractive change, the harms of isolation and the healing of connection, the porous nature of the mind and relational nature of reality, and even Bob's perspective on how to work with spirit entities, demons, and the intelligences of psychedelic medicines. So that's the overture, and that's the episode you're about to jump into. Before we do, a quick point about sound. There's a weird sound happening in the beginning of the interview that if you are anything like myself, you'll probably be like, oh, what is that sound? It's very distracting. I don't know if I can handle it. Well, don't worry. We do resolve that sound shortly after the first blast of info that Bob drops into our craniums, into our deeply embodied mind. And so you don't have to worry about that for too much longer than the moment at which you might find yourself agitated by it. And the other point is this podcast is brought to you by listeners like you on Patreon and through other forms of financial contribution to the show, PayPal, crypto, buying things from the shop like my books or some shirts or some digital stuff, and even people who purchase through one of our affiliates such as Functional Mushroom Company, Mushroom Revival, who makes great lion's mane that I'm holding up on the screen here on YouTube. Anyways, brought to you by listeners like you. So for everyone supporting the show, thank you very, very much. I really, really appreciate it. I love doing this. I love that this is what I get to do in the world. And even as things have been getting really turbulent in my mind and in my life since my car accident, having this, as the thing that I'm offering onto the world continues to feel, challenged by my, by my mind and its lack of functioning like it used to, but, nourished in the sense of still having a purpose. And that really feels good. So yeah, thank you. Extra thank you to the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or listed in the description to this episode, wherever you're checking it out. They are people who have given substantially, either through Patreon or via a one-time donation. So thank you to you. If you're not yet someone financially contributing to the show and you're finding value, please do reciprocate that value in some expression of monitude, as my friend and colleague Sky Dreamer used to call it. Maybe still calls it. I don't know. I haven't checked in with him about it. But yeah, much appreciated doing so. Links to do so are in the description to this episode, wherever you are checking it out, or you could just head to jameswjesso.com/support to see all the options there. That's it for the intro preamble to the interview with Bob Falconer. So with no more further ado, here it is. Integrating Internal Family Systems Therapy with Psychedelics, Adventures of the Mind 163 with Bob Falconer. Enjoy.
Okay, great. Ready.
Okay. Robert, Bob Falconer, welcome to Adventures of the Mind.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I've been following Internal Family Systems for quite a while now, after I was exposed to it a few years ago through Dick Schwartz, and then later having taken some training courses with Frank Anderson, who's also been on the show. And I've also been in the psychedelic field for a decade now as well. And it just so happened that you and your merging of the two came into my awareness during the LAMPS conference of last year, and which was very exciting because I had already been piecing together the possibilities, and I had heard some whisperings about it, but I hadn't found anyone to step in and be like, yeah, here it is. Like, here's the established sort of sense of how they merge, at least as the foundation moving forward. And it was very exciting to discover your work.
Great. Wonderful.
So with that said, some of the listeners might already be like, yeah, internal family systems. Opinion, but a lot of listeners might be like, what are you talking about? So maybe as a basis to start us off, you can give us a general sense of what is internal family systems.
Okay. About 40 years ago, Dick Schwartz created, or actually discovered, I think he would say, this model. It's a model of mental functioning. It came up in psychotherapy, but it's a lot more than that. Some people use it as almost a spiritual path. It's used in education, mediation, all these other fields. The basic idea of it is we're all multiple personalities. We are all multiple. We have many, many different parts, and they tend to hop in and take us over and drive the bus for a little while. And that can get us in a lot of trouble when an angry 12-year-old sort of takes control of the wheel and starts talking to our partner instead of the adult we would like to think we are all the time. Or a screaming 2-year-old is trying to drive the car. Literally, it's not good. So there are all these parts. Now, back in multiple personality disorder, back when they actually used that diagnosis, which they don't anymore, they thought this was a product of trauma. And Dick realized, no, it's not a product of trauma. This is how we're made. And it's a necessary and wonderful thing. And if you look at computer architecture, for instance, you'll see that this is also necessary for computer architecture. You have all these subroutines, which are relatively encapsulated, and they're only sparsely interconnected with other parts of the computer. This kind of structure, which is mathematically described as nonlinear dynamics or complex systems theory, seems to be necessary to any system of a certain degree of complexity. Definitely happens in people. And Dick also discovered there's something in people that's not a part, that's who they really are, which he calls self. And it has a bunch of characteristics. 8 C's. Dick loves alliteration. I always forget a few.
Me too.
Passion, curiosity, calm, creative, connected, clear, courageous. That's 7. That's good enough.
But it was caring. Caring? Did you say caring?
No, I don't think that's it.
Is it? Okay.
Should be. Now we got 9.
Great.
Anyway, you may have noticed that you don't know anyone who walks around like this all the time. And the point is, we're all hijacked by parts the vast majority of our lives, and we don't operate out of who we really are. Now, one message from Dick that's radically different than every other psychotherapy is that this core self cannot be damaged. It can't even be dirtied. It's like the sun on a stormy day. The storm can be so bad, it blows down your house, floods your town, absolute devastation. But when those clouds part, the sun is there, unaffected. And that's who we really are. Healing in the IFS model is an inner work job, and it's about helping the parts each have a relationship to that self. So they're not alone and think they've got to do things on their own. And then the self can really step into leadership of the entire system. Now, this sounds very simple-minded, but if you actually stay with it and follow out its implications, it implies revolutionary changes in how you do therapy.
There's this map of the mind, this sort of multiplicity of the mind, subroutine. I don't think subpersonalities. I don't know if that term applies.
Subpersonalities would be good. Other systems use that. He uses the word parts because that's the simplest word, and it's the most user-friendly.
And parts, the sort of like the frame of mind that brings up saying like a part in discussion of some various sort of like thing that's happening internally is not unique to IFS. There's parts work or doing parts stuff is actually increasingly quite common. Yep. What in particular is special about the IFS model with respect to parts work, and what does that look like in a therapeutic context?
Okay, good question. Yeah, there are more and more schools of parts work, and I did a lot of other ones. Gestalt is famous parts work. Psychosynthesis, voice dialogue, ego state therapy. There's a lot of them, and there are more and more because it's so effective. There are a couple things that are very distinctive about IFS, and this is this discovery of self or realization of self, that we all are this core that cannot be damaged, no matter what happens. And my own background was extreme violence and trauma. I mean, off the scale. And those are the kind of people I worked with much of my life. And we were told, you didn't get what you needed when you were little kids. You're basically damaged goods. Take a lot of meds and expect a miserable little life. And Dick comes along and says, no matter what happened to you back then, the core of who you really are is not even dirtied. That's an incredible message for kids who were beaten, raped, severe trauma all the time. And it's life-saving for a lot of them. So that's one part. The other thing is he's divided up parts in a very helpful way. Now he says this isn't so important. It's just sort of a roadmap to help therapists work with people. But there are basically protective parts and exiles who are being protected. And the sort of classic cliche of this would be there's some part that's like 3 years old and desperately lonely and really, really hurting, and it's hidden way, way, way down in your psychic basement. And then there's some tough 12-year-old part who's got a leather jacket on and a knife in his waistband, and he's saying, ain't nobody going in there and touching that 3-year-old, you know? So there's a protective layer, and then there's an exiled layer. And he divides the protectors further into managers and firefighters. And so it gives us a very good way of working with these parts very respectfully. Even the ones that look terrible, like suicidal parts, are actually there for a good reason. And we need to respect them and not try and destroy them to help the person. That's a huge mistake that other therapies have made.
Can you flesh that out a little bit? Because you're saying that there's a part that's suicidal, you know, like, and it's doing some sort of important thing, but it's also, you know, suicidal. So what's the difference in parts therapy between trying to make that suicidality go away by making the part go away and making the suicidality go away in some different orientation, like some different process?
Okay. IFS assumes that all parts have a good intention. And if you start talking to a suicidal part of someone, you know, if someone's coming in, I want to kill myself. Well, let me talk to the part who wants to kill you. What's good about killing him? Then he won't be on the planet anymore. Well, what'd be good if he wasn't on the planet anymore? Then he wouldn't be suffering so horribly anymore. Now you found the good intention. Often it's a little harder than that, making it simple. And then something like, well, how would you feel if we could make it so he doesn't have to suffer so much anymore and you wouldn't have to kill him? And the answer 90+% of the time is, that would be wonderful, but you can't do it. And we just say, would you give us room enough as an experiment to try and to prove to you we can? And another thing we say, if the suicidal part is really out of control, just, you know, I respect you and what you're doing. I get your good intention. I don't mean any disrespect in this, but I'm going to do everything I can to help keep your body alive. Which is a very different message than you're an idiot. How could you be so stupid as to want to kill yourself?
Sure, or selfish.
Yeah, selfish. We're going to amputate you and put you in the garbage dump, buddy. Which establishes a hostile relationship with that suicidal part.
Mm-hmm. So in all of that, where's this special, this unique thing to IFS? Where's the self in all of this?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. The way you would elicit that, and this is sort of a magic question in IFS, you would ask the person, how do you feel towards that part of you who wants to commit suicide? And they'll probably start off with something like, well, I'm really afraid of it. That's another part. Hi, scared part. Welcome. Of course you'd be scared. And then you negotiate with the scared part until it'll step back a little, give you some room to be with the suicidal part so we can help it. Then you ask the client again, how do you feel towards the suicidal part now? And there might be many other parts that have to step back, but eventually you'll get to, well, I'm sort of curious about it. Or I feel some compassion. It must be in a lot of pain. Or one of these self-qualities. And then we just ask the person, offer that compassion, curiosity, whatever it is, to the suicidal part and see how it responds. Most of the time, the suicidal parts have known nothing but hatred in their entire existence, and people trying to get rid of them. So they're going to be a little distrustful, to put it mildly, or, you know, but once they can accept a little bit of compassion, connection, curiosity coming towards them from the client's self, they can start to build a good two-way relationship, which can really change everything. That's the location of healing in IFS, is really creating these strong internal relationships. Most people walking around the planet, and this is more me than Dick per se, Most people are civil wars. There's one part saying, I want to leave my wife. There's another part saying, we got to stay. She's really good. And they're just going at each other all day long. Or this job is terrible. I need the job. All kinds of fights like that all the time. I think most people spend like 70, 80% of their life force in these internal civil wars. And if you start doing this kind of parts work, you can transform people's systems into something a lot more like a jazz band that's really, really good at improvising together, or a great symphony orchestra under the conductor being the self. So that we don't want to put all these parts in a blender and create some bland mush. No, we need all the parts with all their different attributes.
Such as the suicidal part, when it is liberated from the burden of having to protect from that suffering, it might be serving some other very useful protective action that's not sort of like against the livelihood or like the living of the person.
Yeah. And ironically, some of these really fierce protectors turn into the biggest supporters. Mm-hmm. They're like cheerleaders almost, or coaches or something like that.
Yeah, one of the things that I do in my own process, I see a therapist that works with IFS, and I also do some for myself in like meditation. Actually, the self-facilitation and meditation I learned from Dick Schwartz, Greater Than the Sum of Your Parts meditation series, is getting to a place where I try to get each of the parts to be like, I don't want you to go away. I like need you on my team. I just need you to trust my guidance. I also need you to show up in the moments that I've lost the plot here to make it really evident to me that I'm no longer at the helm and that something needs to be addressed that I'm missing. And that, when I'm able to remember to imply that, because, like walk, walk, crawl, or walk, walk, fall, walk, walk, fall. Usually it feels pretty good. It sort of creates the sense of being in an orchestra, in the sort of like the musicality of life, rather than this constant battle, even when things can be quite difficult. Speaking as someone without any extreme trauma in my life. Mm-hmm. Now, this is all as a basis to then start talking about psychedelic therapy and where this all fits in. But I got another particular question about the IFS therapy, which is that you mentioned protectors and you mentioned exiles, right? Yep. So is the work here to bring self energy to the protector parts so that they're sort of like on the team? Okay. But then what about the exiles, right? Because they must be protecting a wounded part. So how does IFS therapy address that wounded part as well?
Okay, great question. The first thing is IFS realizes this internal system is a delicate ecology. And there's all these different battles going on there that are all sort of balanced. And you start messing around with this kind of randomly, you just upset the balance and create chaos. That's not so helpful. So the first step in IFS is you meet whoever the protectors are, and you get their permission to go to the tender ones they're protecting. And you don't expect them to change their protector behavior, even if it's pretty gnarly. And this would include addictions. Just say, let us go to the ones you're protecting. Then we go back to the ones they're protecting. And there's more steps to it than this, and it's more complex than this. But basically, you witness where it's stuck in the past, how it got hurt, and everything it wants the person to know about how bad it was back then. Like, the abandoned baby in the crib crying and nobody came. It needs to be witnessed until it says, it's the one who decides, yeah, you get me now. And it's the person who has to get it, the client, not the therapist. This can be done entirely between the person's parts and the person. And this is very helpful with sex abuse survivors, because a lot of times they have too much shame to say that stuff out loud to anybody. So it gets witnessed. And then you retrieve it. You say, are you ready to come away? from that time and place where you've been so stuck to someplace safe and comfortable. You help the client and that part come to someplace safe and comfortable. And then you ask the part, are you ready to unburden all those extreme beliefs, emotions, energies you had to take on back then to survive? And then this is probably the most blatantly shamanic part of IFS. We typically would use the elements. We don't just say, yeah, just blast all that stuff out. We say, you need to put this stuff somewhere. So would you like to put it, have water washed away, fire burn it up, bury it in the earth, have the wind take it, have light take it, whatever you want. Then they get all this gunk out of them and transformed in one way or another. Then we ask that part if it wants to invite in new qualities to fill those empty spaces and, go through that slowly. And then when that part feels complete, we go back to the protector and say, hey, this real tender one you've been protecting all these years is doing better now. You want to check this out? And now, are you willing to let go of the role you had? Being suicidal or drinking a fifth of whiskey a day or whatever that protective role was. So that would be the sort of big picture flow of the model.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, all of that is happening, you said, to be witnessed in particular, not just witnessed, but witnessed from occupation of self. Like you're fully, not just occupied, embodied in self energy, witnessing these parts in this process.
It has to be a relationship between the person's self and the person's parts. That's where the real healing is, not between the person and the therapist. Mm-hmm. That's revolutionary for many kinds of therapy too.
Mm-hmm. And this sounds like, as you're describing it, this language maybe is not the most specific, but it sounds very experiential. It's about, creating a kind of container, either with a therapeutic support or within oneself, to go through a kind of inner experience, an inner journey that creates a kind of something of a meaningful kind of experience within the journey in your mind that somehow then translates into a reorganization of one's sort of interiority, one's inner self, and thus how they perceive and engage themselves in the world. Am I on the thread there?
Exactly. Yeah. From an IFS point of view and from my personal point of view, insight is sort of the booby prize. You can understand this stuff up, down, sideways, back and forth, and it doesn't change a thing about how you behave or how you feel. There has to be some experiential process, mm-hmm. which is one of the wonderful things about medicine work.
Yes, and as a shifting into that, I recently watched a lecture or webinar, something you were giving, and you talked about the difference between counteractive change and generative change. And I think what we're speaking to here is generative change. Maybe you could just give us a rundown of those okay. two things and their differences before we move into psychedelic therapy.
Okay. Well, counteractive change is like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. You've got some negative message going in your head, like, I'm a jerk, I'm a jerk, I'm a jerk, I'm a jerk. So you start another message going in your head, I'm a good guy, I'm a good guy, I'm a good guy, I'm a good guy. And you say, I'm a good guy more and louder than the I'm a jerk voice. And eventually you'll start believing or following that I'm a good guy voice. Trouble is, you have to keep doing that basically forever. And it drains you of energy. So it tends to peter out and you tend to get bored with it. A generative change is like planting a seed and putting some water on it, and then you go away and a tree grows. I think the best example I know of this comes from psychedelic work. It was one of the phase 2 MAP studies of MDMA for the treatment of PTSD. They did their protocol, which is, I think it's 3 MDMA sessions with 9 therapy sessions. And at the end of this protocol, 52% of the people no longer qualified for PTSD at all on all the written tests. Now, that's better results than anything else is getting by far. That's great. The real generative change is a year later, with no further treatment, 68% of that sample no longer qualified for PTSD. So something had happened in that treatment period that grew in the people all on its own, so that there was more and more healing a year later. That's generative change.
Yeah, and these were people. I think you had just said that like no other form of therapy for them seemed to be working. So it wasn't like 50% of traumatized people. It was like 50-something% of like the most deeply traumatized people. Yeah.
Well, PTSD. Yeah, it's not. Other treatment modalities don't get great results with it.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that's a kind way to put it.
So now we're on to psychedelic therapy, which anyone listening here is already, they're tuning in probably because if they're listening to my show, they're tuning in because they already have a sense of the psychedelic stuff. They're tuning in for the IFS blend here. Maybe it's the other way around, but psychedelic therapy is therapy provided with the assistance of a psychedelic substance, which looks different depending on the substance and the dose and the access point. Underground, overground, etc. For like, please give whatever sort of baseline you think that you need to share about what psychedelic therapy is to answer this question. But what unique benefit do you see Internal Family Systems offering psychedelic therapy before we go into how it is that they actually enter?
Well, it's going to be sort of impossible to separate those. But with this parts model, and especially realizing people's minds are this very delicate ecology, and that we really need to be respectful of all the protectors, even if at first they're kind of hard to put up with. You know, the preparation sessions in IFS focused psychedelic therapy are going to look like getting permission from the protectors. And that's the primary task, which is very different than setting an intention, because protectors can feel that's somebody trying to bulldoze past them. So we go to the most resistant parts who don't want to do the medicine and talk to them and get permission from everyone. And I would go, you don't need everybody to be a cheerleader with pom-poms going, oh, this is going to be great. But I would not go ahead and do a medicine session unless every protector said, well, okay, you can try it. At least you need begrudging consent. Otherwise, you're probably going to increase the internal civil war. Sometimes the medicine will override that, because it's got such wonderful effects. But why fight that? Why walk uphill through thick mud when you don't have to?
So the benefit that you're seeing is that as a part of preparation, because for people who aren't already sort of like in the know on this, what a psychedelic experience can offer is really determined by its context of use. And a huge part of that context is how we've prepared physically, internally and externally, mentally, emotionally, etc. And that in the therapeutic preparation, IFS serves this role of getting all the parts on board so that there aren't any protector parts that are going to like go to war during the process, or perhaps afterwards when they're allowed back in after they were forced out by the substance.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
So, okay, we're in a trajectory that I hadn't prepared for, so I'm improvising a little bit. So where does then? So then how does that work? What's the question here? There's something in my mind about, maybe I'm fishing for some sort of discussion about the intelligence of a particular substance or something. So then with the parts out of the way, then the healing happens with the substance. So we're just creating a space wherein the natural relationship between the person, protector parts, stepping aside, experiencing whatever my language, the intelligence of the substance that they're consuming. Is that on board? How do you feel about that statement?
Let me give you sort of the basic quick outline of how I think IFS works best with medicine. That might help. And I do, I've taught this quite a few times, sometimes in 8 hours, sometimes in 24 hours, so that I'm really just giving you a bird's eye view. The first thing would be getting permission from the protectors. You go in, and during the session, it would be follow the medicine, follow the medicine, follow the medicine. Now, in some low-dose medicine experiences, the people are relational throughout the entire experience. But I think most of the people I've been coaching are using higher dosages than that, and they're not. We want to follow the medicine. And IFS is very helpful there, because as an IFS person sitting with someone doing medicine, you know that the real healer in the room is the self in that person, not us. And a psychedelic person knows if they're any good at all, the real healer is not them, it's the medicine. So it makes it easier for us to step back and trust the medicine, step back and trust the self. We talked about that unburdening, witnessing, retrieval, unburdening phase of when you get the exile and get it out of where it's stuck. I've been talking to Michael Midhofer about this, the MAPS guy, and he said he's never had to do that part of IFS with medicine. The medicine seems to take care of that on its own. So he's never had to do a formal unburdening. And I think he's the world's most experienced MDMA therapist, at least in a medical, therapeutic framework. Anyway, never say never. I'm sure there are times that will come up. Toward the end of the actual medicine experience, I think there's an incredible therapeutic opportunity that's usually missed. Because if you think of it as a system with all these different parts, with complex lines of interrelationship going in all sorts of directions, and some conflicts and some alliances, and this complex system, that all sort of works together, usually the medicine melts all of that. It's like if you had a ski slope where everybody was skiing down certain ways, and there'd be certain sort of well-worn grooves, and nobody's going anywhere else, that would be somebody's system. The psychedelic experience would be a huge new snowfall, and there's this virgin field where anybody can go anywhere. Everything's fresh and new, and possibilities are wide open. So if you don't intervene and help the person toward the end of the session, they'll just sort of automatically, by habit, go back into those old, or they're more likely to go back into those old paths down the mountain and start re-wearing those same old grooves. And I'm thinking that afternoon, evening, or the next morning at the latest. And I know for people sitting with psychedelic sessions, after 6, 8 hours, whatever it is, you're tired. You don't want to do therapy with somebody. You want to go home, have dinner, of course. But I think that's a real window of opportunity. And I was even joking with someone the other day, it's the Uber driver taking your client home who gets the real therapeutic window. And with in that window, the system is so fresh, and there are all these pathways. It just takes little nudges and real gentle, sort of permissive suggestions that people can reorganize their system in a new way, or at least try it out, or come back with a more flexible organization of their system. And then there's follow-up, because very often, you mentioned this before, sometimes protectors will feel they were pushed aside by the medicine, and they'll come back and they'll be pissed off. So you have to welcome them back in and talk to them. And, there's a lot of other follow-up that can happen, because if they're exiles who've been buried deep, deep, deep in some psychic sub-basement, they may have seen the light of day and smelled fresh air and be really eager to come out now. So there's a lot of room for support, both before and after. I know many IFS therapists who work with medicine insist on at least 3 90-minute preparation sessions and at least 3 90-minute integration sessions. And I think that's about right. Something else I think is ideal but ridiculously expensive is to have 2 people do the sitting, preferably a man and a woman. It makes it safer. There's not going to be any sexual acting out. Even if you're really clean and you tell people that, it still sort of can be in the air. And also, that way at the end of the day, you're not totally exhausted. And one or the other of you will probably have the resilience and energy to really, really be there with the client as their system starts to reorganize, recongeal, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm. So what does integration specifically look like? Because like when I imagine integration, I imagine something more than just IFS processes. There's there are little actions that are taken in people's lives. There's different practices or so on and so forth to get a deeper understanding of what happened in the experience. Because it's generally not like, oh, my parts set down, I took the psychedelic, I had this really clear and coherent specific thing that happened that makes totally lots of sense in how it applies in my life 3 days later. Where does IFS sit inside of the larger sort of, system of integration practices that follow a person's journey?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very often the journey is opening up these psychic basements. And there've been all these parts trapped down in there. And then there are all these protectors who were really, really angry. And now you've sort of kicked the beehive, and they're tense and nervous. And are you going to be able to handle this? And, so they're watching you really, really carefully. And I was watching, Roland Griffiths was on a class given by the Harvard Divinity School recently. And I love Roland Griffiths. I think he's just a true giant in the field. And he's got this 6 qualities that he defines mysticism, and he's shown with all this evidence that the more of these 6 qualities you have, the more healing will come from your psychedelic experience. And I'd never thought of this objection before, but the professor at the Harvard Divinity School was saying, you're medicalizing the mystical experience. You're trying to evaluate the mystical experience in terms of what kind of healing it can do for people. And that this actually downsizes it and limits it and might even, in a sense, be disrespectful experience. Now, so I want to be really careful I don't do that.
Yeah.
And that's a subtle issue,
Yeah, one of the things that I don't know if you were finished where you're going with the integration. One of the things that I was once writing a book, and then a truck literally interrupted that process, and I'm still in the recovery phase of that. But was thinking about like the mystery, so the divine, etc., and that it is forever beyond our conceptual grasp. And if at any point we think that we've got it, we've lost it. and whatever models we have for it are actually just, the model is not the terrain, or the map is not the terrain. This, old saying. It's like, if we start to think that the model is the thing, what we're now interacting with is essentially like a cadaver that we're dissecting, right?
Exactly.
It's not the living, breathing thing in the larger system of life that it came from.
Yep, exactly. There's a wonderful saying in the history of religions: doctrine and theology are the corpse of experience.
Ooh, wow. Never heard that before. That's good.
Yeah, we don't want the corpse, and it's so easy if you are a little ham-handed in the integration to go to that corpse. You say, I like the phrase "effing the ineffable." It's disrespectful to F the ineffable.
I took that to like a really 18+ place. I was like, well, it depends on the vibe, I guess. The kind of healing you're getting.
Yeah. Well, if it's a goddess, there's a lot more to integration. Mm-hmm. One thing I think is super important, and not all therapists would agree with me on this, but I'm right. I work really hard with people to decouple internal change inside their world and external change in how they live their lives. And because if those things are coupled like cars and a train, it's going to make it much harder for them to make the internal changes. Because they'll think, oh my God, if I do this, then I'm going to have to make blah, 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 blah. So it puts all this weight on these internal changes. So if we can separate those two and go, you can make these internal changes without having to, overthrow and rewrite your whole life. That's a separate layer of decision making that we can work on later. I think that's a very important thing to do in integration.
Now that I want to jump in just because I want a clarification there. So in the scenario where it's like, the realization is I have felt trapped and stifled, and I tasted what it feels like to be free in my spirit and in my sort of like sense of embodiment. And now I want to like bring that more deeply into my life. That's the internal change. But the things I feel stifled by are my mortgage and my, my job and my so on and so forth, that I can see where the decoupling is like, you can start practicing feeling free and finding freedom before like selling your house and like moving to Bali, in 2 weeks. But then how does that apply when the person is coming out of therapy and they're realizing that the external is a significant limitation to the internal, such as in scenarios where there's some form of mistreatment, perhaps even explicitly abuse in a person's life, and I immediately there's the sort of like most macro look at that, like, oh, domestically, right, or in a job, right, but then even still, like, what about in a society as well? But maybe you could leave the larger question there. But what about that instance and separating the internal and the external?
I still would do that, because it puts too much pressure on the internal change. And then once, you've got this system that's all sort of wide open, this new snowfall, you're getting new patterns coming down, it reorganizes in a new and more flexible way, and you don't want worries about the external world interfering with that process. Okay, so the system is now reorganized in a more flexible, less conflictive way inside. And then as a second process, you start looking about, how do I take this into the world? So it's not like you don't do it. You just separate the phases. Is that?
Yeah. Makes sense. And it feels like imperative, especially in the times that we're in, that we take that to that next level. Although sometimes it can convolute it, but like bring it up that level. I use the term ladder of abstraction to like really talking about the social elements, because I recently had Martin Scherp from Synthesis Institute on the show, and he's not the only person to speak to this, but there was a sentiment there, something like, if psychedelic healing is happening within a larger socioeconomic context, and the actual economic context of the therapy is such that that socioeconomic context is the cause of the illness, then what is the psychedelic therapy really going to do for us if we immediately step back out into the same context that created the illness in the first place? I'm not sure if that was coherent, but just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Okay. I have a lot of thoughts. These are not IFS. Don't blame Dick. Don't blame IFS.
Blame Bob.
Blame Bob, yeah. I believe we live in a vast open-air insane asylum. The craziest inmates are running the place. And that's only sort of a joke. I think that's very close to true. In the political realm, in a lot of the school, all over the place. That's sadly really, really close to true. So what do you do in a world like that? You're not going to be able to jump out there and change it all, but you can live in it in a way where you're not contributing to the nasty stuff. And I've had to really focus my attention and wouldn't be right for everybody, but I focus my attention very narrowly, like with those horse blinders on. There's human suffering in front of me. How do I help reduce that? And just stay with that. And I don't want to be contributing to this, being part of the problem. There's another thing I want to say, because you brought up the economic thing. I've worked a fair amount in bringing IFS to non-Western cultures. I taught in China. I introduced IFS to Pakistan. I've been working on some of the reservations here in America and Canada, and it's a big deal for me. The suffering on the planet is just too vast for the Western therapy model to work. I mean, at its best, the Western therapy model is a linear progression, one-on-one like this. It's ridiculously expensive and typically slow. We absolutely need something that has an exponential growth curve. We were talking about that generative change before. We need something, like that, but big time like that. So I've been looking a lot at how can we do this? And among the indigenous people here, healing always happens in a circle. They think it's bizarre to go sit in a private room with someone one-on-one and think that's going to heal anything. And there's this wonderful physician who's actually a professor of medicine at UCSF, Melody Hayes, and she said the disease is not in the body, the disease is in the community, and real healing happens in circles. So there's maybe that model. And then another model I really like that is being used in China very successfully is supervised peer counseling. And the idea there is you give people minimal training so that they can sit with another person and they can interact in ways that will help each other heal. Then you have another layer above them that's sort of better trained, but not like 4 years and an internship. So if these two have problems, you can go here. They can go here. And then above them, you have another level that's better trained. I think they've got 3 levels up, so they can create this huge pyramid. Now that has a geometrical or exponential growth rate potential. And their website gets 1 million hits a day. I mean, they're doing it. It's this little old lady, Dr. Hailong Guo, gray-haired, sort of not too big. And, I was talking to her one day and I said, well, what's your goal? She said, oh, I want to relieve the suffering of millions.
Ambitious, but possible.
Yeah. I thought, this gray-haired little lady might actually do that,
Something with you speaking to bringing in IFS to Indigenous or First Nation communities, what came up for me, and it sort of came up earlier and it didn't make sense to call in, and I'm calling it now, especially with your comment about sort of the Western psychotherapeutic model just like isn't going to cut it for like the degree and the complexity of what we're facing as a planet. And that's sort of a foreshadowing in a way, is that there's a real individualistic, anthropocentric focus on me in Western society, right? At least presently, maybe not necessarily historically, but at least presently. And I've been reading a book from Darsha Narvaez, who does work with neurobiological development and human morality and a lot of stuff into the history of small band hunter-gatherers and how they raise their children and how that expressed through culture, yada, yada, yada. And then Four Arrows, who I'm just coming into contact with his work now, who's an Indigenous scholar who speaks about the Indigenous worldview and a number of other things that I'm learning more about. And they explicitly, one of the things they talk about is that sort of anthropocentric me orientation being a consequence of how we're all sort of, our neurobiology is damaged in its very development away from what would have been human flourishing, and creates a sort of like self-protective, me-focused, object-focused, either supremacy or submission kind of inclination in us, which then expresses out through communities, institutions, the stories that lead our culture, etc. And that Indigenous communities, there's a strong sense that the plants, the animals, the water, that all of life is sacred, but that these non-human others are persons too. And I mean, I'm speaking obviously from the best I can understand. I'm not an authority on this. And so when I think about IFS and the benefits it can offer beyond the person, a lot of times I really don't hear a lot of talk about beyond the human as well. And I'm wondering, especially with work with psychedelics, so much of the psychedelic healing experience comes when people feel deeply connected. And a lot of that connection does feel connection with life itself in all its forms. What are your thoughts on this, on healing, IFS, the non-human world, our relationship in the non-human world, the larger web of life, and so forth?
Okay, I have a lot to say on this. I'm writing a book now, and I hope a truck doesn't stop me. I'm almost done after 10 years, more than 10 years of work on this book. Where to start? Okay. In anthropology now, there's a lot of talk about what they call the new animism, which is basically the idea that everything has spirit. And that we relate to it. We don't use it. And the idea that we're the only things with spirit is only about maybe 500 years old in the West. And it's, even today, it's only held by a quote, elite, the people with the controls of the printing press and the universities and stuff. I don't think the core problem is really individualism per se. I think it's slightly different than that. And that's our model of mind. Tanya Luhrmann, who is a magnificent anthropologist and wrote a book called How God Becomes Real, which is just, a lot of her other books are great too. But anyway, she calls this the citadel model of mind. Here in the West, in this elite, academic view of who we are, we've developed this model where who we are is our mind, and it's encased in this bony structure up here, and everything in it is ours, and it's private, and it's our identity. And a woman in England, Isabel Clarke, has developed a very similar theory, and they don't know each other's work. She calls it the billiard ball model of mind. This model of mind is wrong. We are relational. Ideas and stuff come in and out. Our minds are porous. This is the realization of animism, the core realization. And The Citadel model of mind makes us incredibly brittle and fragile. And Luhrmann has done all this work comparing the results with psychosis in America versus, well, one of her earlier studies was America versus Accra, Ghana, and Chennai, India. Now, India has about 5,000 psychiatrists for 1 billion people and no social safety network at all. Nothing. They get better results with psychosis than we do. And the astounding thing that I whack myself in the head and go, what? We are trying to export our methods to them instead of studying them and saying, what are you guys doing? It is so... Ghana gets better results too. Her idea was that one of the really, really, really important things that's different there than here is this rigid, brittle model of mind. And if you look at other things like Gregory Bateson, he talked about mind and nature and necessary unity. He says these things evolve together. They don't exist separately. It's a relationship. To try and talk about mind without talking about nature is actually meaningless. And there's a lot more. I could go way into this if you want.
Well, then why don't you try to spin it together into sort of like a concluding statement,
okay.
a temporarily concluding statement, because of course you're still working on the book, right?
Yeah. But it is normal and healthy and good to experience thoughts, ideas, emotions, and stuff coming to us from outside our own brain. And the idea that we own or our identity depends on every thought, feeling, emotion, whatever that we experience inside our heads is just wrong. And it leads to a lot of trouble. And it leads to a lot of trouble in terms of if anyone starts hearing voices, they think they're psychotic and they go to a mental hospital and get all these drugs that destroy their mind. It also leads to trouble in psychedelic trips. If you go in there with this basic expectation that my mind's porous, stuff comes in, stuff goes out, that's great, that's how it is, it's basically relational, you're much more able to enjoy the medicine experience and be open to spiritual experiences too. You don't go, oh, that's terrible, I can't handle it. You're wide open to that kind of stuff.
So I mean, there's a couple lines here, one of which I wanted to touch on, so I'll keep it second, which is the mind being porous, meaning that the experience we're having, our stream of experience, right, that we're having at any given time is influenced by a lot of factors. For example, what part has got the wheel, right? But then also, what surroundings are we in? And I think one of the most gross, not like disgusting, but gross isn't like rough, examples would be just how much our eye function influences our cognition and our physiological state. If I'm in a small, low ceiling situation and I have a narrow focused band, that is going to impact my nervous system to funnel me in, increase likelihood of anxiety, and with increased anxiety, increases likelihood of self-protective mechanisms, which means me first thinking, follow the cascade from there. But if I'm out in the big open sky, there are trees, there's all these different colors, that changes how my nervous system is operating. Add in all the other things that are non-visual, and now add in this other layer of there being intelligences, and this is my imposition, and maybe you agree, there being other intelligences, including those of the plants and the animals and etc., that we do have a relationship with, but we could have an intentional relationship with. And all of a sudden that really changes our experience of what's possible in life. And I can see very much so how, in the same way the comparison between the low ceilinged room and the computer gets us all tensed up and like me focused, well, maybe something similar from a spiritual perspective or a worldview or the nature of being perspective, when we include a I think this is different, not my language, but like an interpenetrating connectiveness with all of the life around us and how that changes how we are in our relationship with that. If you have any comments there.
Oh, yeah, a lot. I've been deeply involved until COVID, I was deeply involved in the ecstatic dance world for 30, 40 years. And you could feel that. Anybody would feel that. You go into a room where 60, 70, 80 people are entrained to one rhythm and are dancing hard, and it induces states of consciousness that are incredibly powerful and can be incredibly healing. And that's a reality that I think everybody who will do that will experience. I mean, it's not weirdness or rocket science or something. It's a basic fact of human experience. And yet we have this model of mind in the West where we're supposed to pretend this thing up here is this citadel with all these walls around it. It's just really, really wrong. And it's really damaging. And just sort of having an intellectual realization of, oh, yeah, this idea is not so good. It's a lived thing. You know, you have to. The model of mind isn't really so much about what you think; it's about how you live in the world. And I think you can get an intuitive feel right away for how being very comfortable with a porous mind is so helpful in psychedelic journeys.
Mm-hmm. So let's take this to another level here. A place that, or like maybe walk through a different door that has been ajar for the last several minutes. And it's a place that I tend to try to balance some level of ambivalence to, in the sense of like not landing too hard on any one particular side of this, because I don't know. But inclining towards what I'm about to describe, which is that a common experience, maybe not a ubiquitous experience, but a very common experience in psychedelic sessions is encounters with seemingly separate sentient intelligences or entities that have their own agenda, and at least from the experience of the person on the journey, appearing as though they have their own sense of what it is to be, that they are, you know, their own things, and we're interacting with them. And there's a lot of different ways to look at what that might be, you know, one of which is just, it's exactly as it appears to be, right? Another of which could be something else. Another of which could be, no, these are all just sort of like metaphorical iterations of, you know, parts of yourself that you're alienated from, and thus they are experienced and rendered as alien, or etc. What is your take on this? Because you just spoke to this porousness of mind, right? Meaning things can come in. Well, are entities those things, and what thing are they?
Okay. Now I want to speak for myself, not
of course,
spokesman for IFS now. If you want to get the IFS view on this, talk to Dick or somebody there, because that way I can say whatever I think, no matter how crazy it is. I think these things definitely exist. They definitely seem to have intention and consciousness and subjectivity of their own. Very often experiences like this are parts. They're parts of us that have just been hidden away and buried very, very deeply. But there's other stuff in addition to that that's not part of our system at all. Now, I have lots of theories about what these could be, but that's not so important. Again, I go back to putting on my blinders and going, there's human suffering in front of me. How do I help? So I want to know how to work with these things rather than what are they. And I think one of the number one rules about working with them is treat them as though they are full spectrum personalities. Whatever my cognitive structures around that are, working with them goes better if I treat them as if they are people with intention and all these other characteristics that a full spectrum person would have. And that's more a matter of clinical experience of having worked with a lot of people who have this kind of phenomena.
Mm. Now, does that includes both the benevolent feeling intelligences, or I'll just use the term entities or spirits, but does it also include the ones that, are often described as demons? I mean, not just in psychedelic work, mostly in the Western tradition as demons, but do you work similarly if something like that comes up?
Yeah, definitely. Tanya Luhrmann, again, has a phrase I really like. She just talks about spiritual presence experiences. So you don't have to sort out the angels from the demons. It's just this whole class of experiences of some seemingly intentional being can make itself known inside your mind. And I would say, yeah, treat them all that way, but as though they're full spectrum people. Not because that's necessarily what they are, but because it will go better. You'll be better able to interact with them that way, in a way that's good for them and good for the kind.
Mm-hmm. So would this then include what's the word in my parlance? The medicine, right? It's a very functional term to create a kind of other relationship, other not in the othering, but other as in the I and other, mm-hmm. I and you, or I and thou kind of relationship with the experience a particular substance might bring to you, and your experience of that substance bringing that experience. Now, I'm wondering what your thoughts are from an IFS perspective, your personal perspective through the IFS lens, not IFS perspective, on the medicines and them being a kind of intelligence with, I think the term used was a whole personality. And does that differentiate? And does that differentiation between, say, MDMA, ketamine, psilocybin, LSD, change the way you would engage them in therapeutic context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. A lot of people I know, they talk about Mother Ayahuasca or something like that. And I was talking to her and she said, and I encourage that. It might be right. It might be a spirit who lives in that plant who comes and talks to us. We don't know. And so that's the respectful thing to do. But for the rationalists, which is probably many of your audience, you can also think of it this way. Our brain evolved and our cognitive structures evolved. And probably the biggest and most highly developed cognitive structure is social interaction. If you think about it a little bit, we humans are pretty pathetic. I mean, our claws, look at that. That's our teeth. We can't really run that fast compared to a cheetah or anything. And when we're standing up, our vital organs are right there where anybody can tear them out. This isn't good, gang. So how did we develop, our position? And the only thing we have that other animals don't have way better than us is our ability to connect socially. Like primates, typically the biggest band is a dozen or so, more or less. The early hunter-gatherer bands, they're now thinking we're about 150. How did we develop the skills to go from a dozen to 150? That's super important in the 99% of our evolutionary history that was as hunter-gatherers. That's this whole highly evolved social intelligence module in our brain. So even if it's only this, you want to be able to take that module and use it with the experience you're having with medicine. So you call ayahuasca Mother Ayahuasca. And that immediately opens your whole social intelligence module to dealing with her. And that way, even extreme rationalists can use that kind of language and stuff.
And that same might be said for myself personally, with psilocybin, with the mushroom, right? Yeah. Whatever frame, I in the book that will one day be written again once my brain is more reliable than it is right now, is going back to Pascal's wager on this, not too heavily, because that's sort of like a larger conundrum and its relationship to Christianity and so on and so forth. And it was infinite gains and infinite losses. But in the specific instance of, okay, so they're not real or they are real, right? If they're not real, and I engage them as though they're real, what do I really have to lose as long as it's not an extreme decision in one direction or another? Not really much, right? And if they are real and I don't engage them as such, like what do I have to lose? Possibly quite a bit, right? I don't know. But that doesn't necessarily matter, because it's like, this is the ambivalence thing. It's like we could sort of stand ambivalently and be like, yep, could be real, could be not real. But given what's possible to gain, there's utility and advantage in at least softly leaning towards they are real and engaging them as such. Mm-hmm. Right. And so even from a very, to my mind, rationally, logically, it just makes sense to lean at least ever so slightly towards, yep, at the very least, it is functional for me to perceive this as a whole personality and engage it as such in my experience with it and in my ongoing relationship with its impact on my life.
I keep going back to William James. He talked about radical pragmatism and radical empiricism. And if you really take that view all the way, all its implications, it means what works is what's real. And I just stay with that. What makes people suffer less? What relieves this terrible burden people are carrying? And my answer to that in this case would be relating to these things as if they're full spectrum personalities. They have intentionality, will, all these things, and the depth to them. So that radical pragmatic question, I think we can answer. Or at least we don't get, like a geometric proof or anything, but you can get a really good feeling as to what helps people feel better, what helps relieve their suffering. And I believe it's accepting these things as real. Just like, the poor people who start hearing voices in the West have a really bad time. So what we're doing from the radical pragmatic standpoint is a bad idea.
Mm-hmm. And even bringing it back, to our relationship to mind, to like the larger mind and the porousness, I could be stretching it here and maybe utilizing the argument to try to fish my own conclusions around it. But it's like, it does benefit us to step into a forest and look and see each plant and tree as a sentient intelligence that is perceiving in a way that we may not be able to comprehend on a time scale that is unfathomable to human, linear time scale continuity or whatever, but is perceiving us as there and working as a harmonious living system that is literally breathing around us. That probably offers us a lot more from a relief of human suffering, with one caveat I'll speak to in a minute, than going outside and being like, look at this giant repository of material items I can use to forward my will in the world. Wow. Yep. The caveat of human suffering there is that when we do that, the actual impact of what we're doing to the planet right now and its consequences on the global industrial scale brings about quite a bit of suffering. But in my opinion, that's the kind of suffering we presently don't have enough of, which is the grief that follows when we see what we're really doing to the lives, the non-human life around us.
Yeah. I think, so many of the people like Richard Dawkins and the other, quote, new atheists, the people who claim to be scientists, but in my view, they're actually some of the most fundamentalistic ideologues ever. But anyway, they'll always point to Christianity and look at the witch hunt and look at this and look at that. Yes, Christianity and every religion on the planet did horrible things. Tibetan monasteries, most people like to think, oh, the Tibetan monks are wonderful. They were centers of armies, and they were highly feared throughout Asia. The Chinese armies were afraid of the Tibetan monks because they were such killers. So everybody All religions have that. But the record of scientific materialism is even worse. They've created the world wars. That ideology allows us to destroy the environment. Pol Pot, the guy in Cambodia who killed more than a fifth of the people in his country, he was trained by the greatest leftist French intellectuals of his day and got a PhD from the Sorbonne in political science. Wow. And he took all those ideas and he went back and killed, maybe a third of his countrymen. So all these religions have not done such a great job, but look what the quote scientists, the quote materialists are doing. They got a horrible track record, just horrible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know what happened with this, but not that long ago, I know there was for a while now, there was an increasing push for like the international courts to recognize ecocide as an actual crime. Whether or not anyone in any country is going to do anything about that is whatever. But I think that is a term that, I think a lot of people understandably shy away from, but I think it's something that held for its full impact, is a very relevant one for us to get a sense of right now as a species, as a whole planet.
Yep. They did something in New Zealand that I really like. At the urging of the Maori, the native people there, they declared this one river a person.
Wow.
All the rights of a person. And I think they're going to keep doing it. I don't think it's just one river. I think that's a step in the right direction. And it also goes back to these other things we've been talking about, the new animism, and do you want to treat these things as full spectrum people? And so it's actually happening a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm thinking about now, like the self-orientation, meaning that it's a very small time scale. But if we consider if we expand mind to include all those who have come and gone before us and all those that will follow us after we have come and gone, then our actions and how we choose to show up to the current conundrum, person I hold in very high regards, he calls it the troubled times that we're in, or the sort of spiritual work of our generation, or et cetera. The value of showing up to that, even if our particular efforts don't seem to bear any fruit before our time here is over, the value of it becomes, clear if we're not in a deeply self-protective, self-focused place because of the anxiety and the trauma and the illness and the suffering, et cetera, which I think goes back to one sort of lane of possibility that the kind of expansion of the IFS work that you're talking about might have that allows for that exponential impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I have the same thoughts you do, but in a slightly different language. Isolation which is also this hyper-independence thing, is the cause of so much illness and distress. And, you see this like porous theory of mind. That's the opposite of isolation, right? It's realizing we're a part of a much bigger web. And that also can extend in time as well as out in space all around us. There was somewhere else I was going to go with that, but it's... Tanya Lorman's, spiritual presence experiences. And you were talking about, do we think of these things as people? And I say yes. And I started looking into that. And this idea of possession is spirit possession is one of the most common ideas. It's in almost every culture on the planet. And I've come to believe that there is some kind of basic biopsychological capacity in human beings to connect with something, and it can be incredibly beneficial or it can destroy their lives. Mm. And the most common metaphor throughout time that's been used to describe this is possession states. But we need to study this, even if it no longer fits our ideology, because it's all over the place. And I think that possession states is really just a metaphor,
Yeah, you speaking to entity, possession, etc. There was a book I read recently, a collection of transcribed talks from a symposium some time ago, and one of the people there was talking specifically, like, rationally, how do we study this? And he's like, I don't actually believe these are other intelligences, but I deeply believe something's happening and we need to study it, and here's how we can study it. And so if I don't remember his name, but if you're interested, I can just email it to you after the show. Something else you were saying there, isolation is harmful, and I think this also goes into the IFS work, and in some sense, one of the great benefits of therapy. Like, people think psychotherapy, it's like, oh yeah, so that we're not suffering as much, right? But reducing the bad, pardon the language, moralistic terminology, but like reducing the bad is only part of it. Creating a possibility space or a potential zone where the good can be grown, and this is very Rick Hansen, growing the good kind of thing here, is important, because I could be around people, a lot of people, I could have actually known them for years and still feel deeply isolated because of however it is that my Civil War, using your language, or parts are, engaged in my sense of what's safe to open to or not. I might never truly feel connected with others, even when I have people that I see regularly or access to social time. And so it's really more than isolation because there isn't other people around, but isolation because one is not open to actually connection, which I think also goes into the potential of feeling and connection and relationship with non-human life as well.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I think it was Jonathan Hart who said the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Please.
No, go ahead.
So I want to take a few steps back as a way of sort of like perhaps shifting the trajectory a little bit. When we were talking about the other medicines or the medicines and like seeing it as a full spectrum personality, etc. We mentioned ayahuasca, psilocybin. I could think of some other sort of like plant, like like plant derived sources of medicine that would be easy to describe in that way because the experience is pretty commonly has that feel to it. But with regards to utilizing IFS with psychedelic therapy is generally happening with a reasonably set collection of molecules thus far, right? And some of them are purely chemical, such as, MDMA does ultimately derive from an organic source, saffron, I think. But then we have ketamine as well, right? So I'm wondering, in the landscape of therapy and then maybe in the relationship to the medicine, how is MDMA and ketamine showing up differently than something like psilocybin or ayahuasca?
Well, I think they all have personalities, to use the personalist phrase. MDMA seems to most increase compassion, so that people are able to befriend parts of themselves they have not tolerated, that they've kept locked in those psychic basements. And this is, I think, here in Northern California, the underground slang is MDMA is book 1 and psilocybin is book 2, because that's usually the path people take, and I think it's very appropriate. And ketamine has its own, quirky characteristics. I think they all do. I don't worry so much about whether or not they're, chemically synthesized or not. There's a new underground designer drug that's, from what I hear, because I have a lot of clients who are underground providers or deeply involved in this world, 3-MMC, which evidently is very much like MDMA, but a lot clearer. So that sounds wonderful. And I'm not concerned that somebody cooked this up in a lab, to try and change some change some characteristics of other. LSD is a lab drug, and what I've heard is that there are a lot of people trying to develop a form of LSD that's shorter acting because nobody wants to sit, be a therapist for 12 hours straight. So I'm not so concerned about that.
So where do you see ketamine, like the sort of specific profile of ketamine? Because ketamine is like, okay, ayahuasca, sure. It's not too difficult to access ayahuasca at this time for all its goods and ills.
Mm-hmm.
Psilocybin, the same. MDMA, but ketamine, like access to ketamine right now as a therapeutic modality is exploding because it wasn't already illegal. Yep. And, again, for all its goods and ills. But where does IFS sit in with the specific experience of ketamine, which is very different in my personal experience than MDMA, psilocybin, et cetera?
Yeah, I agree. There's a guy named Dr. Bob Grant who has founded a group called Healing Realms, which is IFS or ketamine-assisted IFS therapy. And I think it can work with that. His belief is that ketamine works more with this clarity issue rather than with the compassion issue. I'm not so sure that's correct. I think what ketamine definitely does is it's a big new snowfall on that ski slope. All the interconnections of that the person's system are loosened and made more flexible for a while. So again, I would, and again, I think it needs, maybe even more than others, needs some kind of therapeutic interaction to go along with it. Because I've gotten reports of several people who've gone to these ketamine clinics where they just stick them in a hospital room and give them an IV, and they've had some bad results. Because, I think people really need therapeutic support going in and coming out because their system will be loosened. And it's really good to have help or at least compassionate witness as they're seeing how they can reassemble that system in a more flexible and hopefully less warlike way in the inner world.
Mm-hmm. To add on to that, ketamine is a huge experience. Like if you're sub-anesthetic, but you're like in the, K-hole, which understandably has negative connotations, but like is the peak psychedelic effects you can get with ketamine, pardon me, but that's some weird shit. So if you're just like somebody who's coming in because you've heard that it's good for depression and so on and so forth, and you're just getting, like injected and made sure that your body doesn't hit the floor and that's about it, coming out of that can be, my proposition is that it's likely could be very disorienting and quite harmful to a person, especially if, and I've heard this spoken to by, can't remember where, but I think it was Mitchell was his last name, Ian Mitchell. He was talking about, this was many years ago, and he was talking about being an emergency medicine doctor and administering ketamine, especially with patients that had opiate dependence, because you could give them lots of morphine and it doesn't actually help with their pain, but ketamine would, but that when they would come out of it, it would be very scary because the things that would start emerging would be very dark things because of the proposition is trauma, etc. Whereas compared to giving it to kids, they come out and they're like seeing Spider-Man and whatever else, right? So I can imagine too, if someone's going in and they have deep trauma, not having someone there to hold you, not necessarily physically, when difficult things might be emerging on the reintegration phase, I think would be essential to prevent harm.
Yeah, and again, doing the preparation, getting permission from the protectors and trying to say, this is going to, you probably won't be able to control your body for a little while, and these other things are probably going to happen, and here's what we think we can do with that. And there are some really good results with ketamine, especially with depression, major depression. And people typically don't use MDMA with major depression because there's often that reactive depression a couple days after the session that some people attribute to serotonin. Now I've trained quite a few providers, and I have a theory or a hypothesis. If the preparation work is done really well, and all the protectors have really given their permission, there is little or no reactive depression afterwards. Most of that reactive depression is protectors coming back on board and kicking ass because they're not happy with being shoved out of the way. So that would be like a tentative hypothesis from a very limited and prejudiced sample, but I think there's a lot of truth in it.
I have also heard you speak previously, I think in reference to Frank Anderson's work, that parts could get in the way of the psychedelics having any effect at all. And I know there are outliers, but of course, outliers in taking psychedelics with a huge subsection of people, that don't have any or a huge amount in a small subsection of larger amount of people, that don't have any effects at all. They can eat 5, 6, 7, 8 grams, and it's not because of antidepressants or whatever else that might be, like changing the effects. And your proposition is that the parts might be able to shut off the psychedelic effects as well. Could you speak more to that?
Definitely. There's absolutely no doubt that can happen. And you mentioned Frank. Frank's a psychiatrist. And when he prescribes traditional psychiatric medicines, he will do an IFS interview with the patient first and get permission from all the parts to take the medicine, because he believes they can wipe out the effects even of major antipsychotics. So, yeah, I definitely think that's true. And I remember these people reporting to me that they were given this guy who was drug naive, massive doses of MDMA, and nothing happened. And I think that's exactly why. He had very, very, very powerful managers who just clamped down, shut everything down. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a normal human capacity.
It's interesting because, I think this word is often misunderstood and misused in a bit of as almost like a pejorative or something, but the placebo effect is very real and very strong, being that the mind can create very real physical responses, such as positive effects, placebo, negative effects, nocebo. And that matters. And if your mind can receive a sugar pill and like heal some crazy disease better than a drug, who's to say that your mind can't also shut off whatever sort of like chemical or hormonal cascade that would result in an effect of a drug?
No problem. My wife's Korean, and I've studied Korean shamanism a lot. And it's fascinating. It's almost all women. One of the things they do is they have these incredibly sharp knives, and they'll take a silk scarf and go like this, and it just slits the scarf. And they fix those vertically. And then they get up on the knives and stand there and sort of dance. And that's where they prophesy, barefoot. And nothing happens to their feet. Nothing. And some of them have these ladders made out of these knife blades, and they will walk up the knife blades in bare feet and get to the top, and that's where they'll channel their spirits. So if you start looking at spirit possession worldwide, there are all sorts of physical effects that are way beyond what modern medical science can explain in any way. There's just dozens of them, So, yeah.
As a totally personal anecdote that is very sort of like a tangent step, I once almost had the opportunity to do like a fire walk at an intimacy festival several years ago in England called Togetherness. But that person, I think they were like sick or something, or for some reason they didn't show up, so I did not get that opportunity. But I really was interested to see if I could do it. But that's very me focused. I just got excited. I was just like, it's such a wild story, but in my frame of mind, believable. Or I have an inclination to be like, yeah, totally.
Well, you're way more courageous than I am because I wouldn't do that myself. But there are all these evidence of people doing it in all these different cultures all over the world. It happens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't want to risk my pink little toes in it, but it happens.
I mean, it would have made the rest of my, I was on tour at the time, back when that was still a thing, both from up here, brain perspective, but also, that thing happened in 2020, made travel kind of weird.
Yeah.
But yeah, would have made the rest of that tour very difficult if my soul was burned. So last sort of question before the where can people find out more and support your work question, is people listening. Okay. I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of people that are interested in psychedelic therapy, psychedelic work for whatever. A lot of those people are already doing that work, both above and underground, and with or without a therapist. Right.
Yep.
And they're going to make their decision either way. Generally, my inclination is to strongly caution anyone before starting any kind of psychedelic work, especially to try to do some healing, unless they're working with a skilled professional or have done quite a bit of tailoring the context to ensure that they're held in a safe and effective way, because it can go poorly. But that said, people are going to do what they're going to do. And wondering if there is any sort of like DIY ways, like do-it-yourself ways, that people who are choosing to journey can safely and effectively integrate an IFS framework into their personal practice, into their personal journey work.
That's a good question. Depends on what kind of outside support they've got. Roland Griffiths, who I think I said before is a big hero to me, his therapists don't use IFS, but they do meet, I think it's a minimum of 8 hours with the people before they do a session. So there's a strong personal rapport with the sitter. That's something everybody can do. Have somebody sit with you you have a strong personal rapport with. Now, I want to say something from the other end of the world. My first experience with psychedelics was in 1967. And I was coming out of a terrible, violent, abusive family, and I was already drinking ridiculously heavily. And I started doing psychedelics, and I lost all desire for alcohol and quit drinking, and haven't had a bad relationship with alcohol since then. I had no therapeutic support in that process. I had friends around, but they weren't sitting with me. We'd just all trip together. Mm-hmm. Somehow the experience of lots of acid over a couple of years derailed what was a surefire trip to severe alcoholism and a life in a dumpster. Mm-hmm. So that kind of thing happens even with no support. Mm-hmm. So,
I mean, yeah, totally. Myself as well, in a way. I think my strong caution is especially for people who are like, oh, mushrooms can reset my brain and heal my depression, so I'll take mushrooms with the intention of healing my depression. Because someone who helps with integration coaching, I have seen many people who have reached out because they're like, I read this and I saw this and I read How to Change Your Mind and yada, yada, yada. And I tried it and now I'm worse. So just a strong caution there, recognizing that I too have also just jumped in and had some really profound positive impact without a therapist present.
I would encourage people who are, that's what they're going to do. Start with MDMA. And then the safest thing to do is start with a fairly good dose of MDMA. And then if you're comfortable with that after a time or two, add a little bit of mushrooms and lower the dose of MDMA a little, add mushrooms. And then more mushrooms, less MDMA, more mushrooms, less MDMA. And then you sort of titrate over to where it's all mushrooms, where it's mostly mushrooms with a little bit of MDMA. That makes it much more difficult to have a bad experience. I mean, you can still do it. Mm-hmm. It makes it hard.
Get parts of your mind to really put their mind to it. It can get tough. Okay, so I want to really clarify this last question. Maybe I missed it, so you might have to just double down because I missed it. But for the people listening, if they want to explicitly, try to safely and effectively integrate IFS framework into their personal practice, what suggestions would you make for them? It could be, listen to this audiobook or read, so on and so forth, or like try this practice, or anything in particular that if you could leave the listeners to be like, if there's this one or two things that you can do that could, like smoothly weave their way in, what would they be?
Wow. There's a book called Introduction to Internal Family Systems by Richard Schwartz. It's short, it's user-friendly, it was written to be non-academic, and it's an easy read. That would probably be the best sort of intellectual introduction. There's a little IFS practice called parts mapping, which almost everybody can do and is very helpful and is very good as a tool in preparation. I encourage people to use it whenever they prepare for an experience. And you sit down, and it's better to do it with somebody. You just say, well, what am I feeling about this experience coming up? Oh, there's some anxiety in my stomach. Well, figure out a way to make some little mark on that sheet of paper that represents that anxiety in your stomach. Okay, back up from that. Wait for a shift to happen in your body. And now what's coming up in relationship to that thing? Typically, when people do this, they'll get 6 or 8 different parts, and these little squiggles represent parts of their system. And then you can start asking other questions like, are these parts, are some of them allies? Do some of them have problems and fight each other? How do you feel about them one after another? Because if the person's hating them, that's another part that's not on the table yet. And then, if to work with this system, let me just say one. Most psychotherapy has a vegetable. The onion, we peel the onions and we get down to the core.
Right.
IFS, it's not an onion. Our vegetable is garlic. It's all these different cloves. So when you do that parts map, you've got a clove of the garlic. Mm. So you do that, and then you see how they're interrelated. And then there are a bunch of questions you can ask. And a real key one is to understand this clove of garlic, which one of these parts should we focus on first? So if you do that, all the parts involved with the upcoming trip will probably make themselves visible on that sheet of paper, and you'll be told what's the doorway in to start working with this system to really prepare the person for the session.
That's great. Thank you.
That's usually people can do that on their own.
Great. Well, we're rounding it out now to the end. Bob, thank you so much for being on the show. Before we close, is there anything in particular you'd like to leave the listeners with respect to where they can follow up more with your work, and what kind of work is available for them to follow up on?
Okay. Well, right now I'm working on that book. I've got a website, robertfalconer.us, so you can see what I'm doing. And there's all sorts of stuff I'm involved in. But, there is one little story I'd like to end with, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah.
It's from William Butler Yeats. He said, now, imagine that everything humanity can know and ever will know is a bubble, a shiny little bubble. Now, that bubble is one of many, many, many bubbles in a little patch of sea foam. And that patch of sea foam is on a beach. And that beach is in an insignificant cove in a vast, dark ocean.
Robert Falconer, thank you for coming to Adventures Through the Mind.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And cut. Okay, that was this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. And I hope you found some value in it. I certainly did. If you did find some value and you would like to reciprocate that value, you can become a patron on Patreon, you can leave a one-time donation. You can purchase something from the shop, digital or physical, or you can purchase something from one of our affiliates, such as Mushroom Revival, who make excellent lion's mane mushroom tinctures, which have been very helpful for me in the last several months since the brain injury. Links to all of that are at jameswjesso.com/support or in the description to this episode. As well, follow up with Bob's work, follow up with IFS. I mean, it's just so interesting. I mean, I spoke to it in an interview, but I use a kind of IFS meditation that I got listening to a Richard Schwartz audiobook, and has just been like so pivotal and awesome. And I was so excited to support or feature this on the show. So I hope you find some interest in IFS. I have another interview with Frank Anderson. I don't remember the episode name. It's on the screen here on YouTube, and also linked in the show notes at jameswjesso.com. But yeah, it's great. So go check it out. Check it out. IFS. Wow. And that's all. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. I will see you on the next one, or maybe on social media. You can follow me there. I have the handles. They're all the same, James W. Jesso. And that's all. So thanks again for tuning in all the way to the end of this episode. I'll see you on the next one. Take care.